Hey everyone, this is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to take a look at Mercury in the sign of Virgo. Now, this is an ongoing part of my Planets in Profile series, which I've been doing for a few years now. I've taken a look at Venus through the signs, Mars through the signs, the Sun through the signs, and also now Mercury through the signs. And picking up with Mercury in Virgo, which is just about finishing up in, so I'm a little behind, but better late than never. And so let's dive in. So, what are the core characteristics of Mercury in Virgo? Well, let's start with the sign Virgo. This is the feminine earth sign. It's a double bodied or mutable sign, and it is the temple of Mercury. So, you kind of put all of those things together because they all contribute to how we interpret a planet in a given sign. Its quadruplicity, its triplicity, or what we'd say its modality and its element. It's a double-bodied sign. It comes on the cusp between summer and autumn. It is an earth sign. It is a feminine sign. So all of those qualities are really important for understanding how planets act and behave when they're in this sign. But most importantly, it is the home temple of Mercury. There's two temples, of course, Gemini and Virgo. This is the feminine temple of Mercury. And it is the exaltation of Mercury. Now, you might be wondering what an exaltation is. And it would take too long to sort of totally unpack why it is that Mercury has a sign where it is both in its domicile and exaltation. But I'll just give you a clue. Exaltations are more lunar in nature, and domicile rulerships are more solar in nature. And the one planet that has the ability to take on both masculine and feminine qualities, or solar and lunar qualities, that's very fluid, that moves between them, is Mercury. And so Mercury has one sign where Mercury has both a feminine or lunar exaltation and a solar or more masculine form of rulership. Now, unpacking that is a really interesting topic that I cover in my year one course. So if you're like jonesing for more of that kind of information that really gets your gears turning, then check out my course on my website, because the new course starts in November again. So Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. My website is nightlightastrology.com. I say that because it is a really interesting topic. It's just not something I can get into in a shorter video on Mercury and Virgo. So when a planet is in Virgo, it is reliant upon its host, Mercury. But when Mercury is in Virgo, that means that Mercury is in his home sign, or its home sign. Mercury isn't a he or a she, really. And so when a planet is in its home sign, it's like you or me in our own house. We're very comfortable there. We have all facility. We're sort of empowered to do what we want, and with some greater degree of ease or strength or clarity. I mean, I don't know. For me, I consider myself to be a good guest in other people's homes, but there's nothing like being in your own house. You know what I mean? So that's the general idea here, is that a planet is generally stronger and more comfortable and more able to express its own natural significations when in its own sign. Now, what would it express otherwise? Well, when a planet, let's say you take Mercury and you put Mercury in Leo, which is the last sign that we explored. Mercury is compromising its own nature, its own significations with those of the sun. So Mercury has to compromise. Let's say Mercury is interested in things like games, anything that goes back and forth, whether it's chess or basketball. You have a kind of contest and a matching of the wits or the minds, or even a lot of back and forth, like a hockey puck moving around back and forth. And there's a sense of fun and play, but also intelligence and skill. It's all Mercury. Now, if Mercury wants to do those things, but it's in Leo, right, then it's going to have to start compromising with the nature of the sun. And the sun is going to, have more to do with things like wisdom and mastery and fame and rulers and things like that, among other things. So you then have Mercury having to express itself through the lens of the sun. And that's what signs are mainly doing in ancient astrology, is they are modifying or blending one planet in relation to another. And they're also distributing topics by virtue of which signs land by whole sign in which houses. So if you have Mercury, in Libra, and that happens to be in the second house, not only is Mercury then going to combine with Venus, the ruler of Libra, and Venus's position in the chart in relation to Mercury will be a part of how that's determined, but also you will have Mercury speaking to the second house topics of money or finances. And so, among other things that belong to the second house, just keeping it simple here. So that's what planets are always doing. So it's so great when a planet gets into its own sign, because when a planet is in its own sign, what to speak of both its own sign and its exaltation, because either are favorable, it is as though the planet naturally has things at its disposal to do more of what is in its own nature to do, not having to compromise or work through the filter of another planet. So the only thing is that makes it a little bit boring when you're coming to talk about the unique, like how do you interpret or how do you make sense of Mercury in Virgo? It's just like, well, it's Mercury, Mercury. It's just really mercurial. But there are some things that really distinguish Mercury in Virgo from other Mercury placements and from Mercury in Gemini even. One of them is this, and if you watch my video that I did on the meaning of the sun in Virgo, you're going to get a lot of really good background for understanding this video. So I recommend you do that. But here's the thing. Virgo is the puella, or the puer, you could say, of the zodiac. One of them. Aries is another, which means that there is an eternally youthful quality. Aries has very little sense of future consequence as a picture of youth and youthful idealism and impulsiveness and even recklessness. Virgo is a picture of youth that is about to be lost, innocence that will have to face darkness, initiation, descent into the underworld, and consequence that comes as a result of the harvest. So one thing that you will see often in the lives of people with Mercury in Virgo, especially if there's other placements in Virgo as well, is that there are really strong contrasts between light and dark, between oftentimes between childhood and childhood lost, and innocence lost, and like that, just that contrast between light and dark in general will play a really strong role in their life, and often will then accompany some really strong mercurial abilities or gifts or talents or skills, or somehow Mercury is really vividly on display in their life. And of course, Mercury is multi-talented, multifaceted. You have Mercury related to mercantile things like business and money and negotiating and the buzz of the stock market, highways and transportation, information exchange, media, communication, to a certain extent, technology, anything where there's a busy flow of information or ideas or data or intelligence or speech or communication. And of course, Mercury in Virgo in particular can be such a craftsman, or craftswoman can be such a skilled artisan and things like that too. So, all right. So here are a few people that I think embody some of these energies well. And by the way, for everyone who chewed me out for not having enough women in my Mercury in Leo video, I apologize. Usually I have a really good mix. Last month I was in the process of moving and I was sort of in a rush, and I was picking up, there's a website that I use, and Astro Data Bank. And some of these websites, you know, when you do a search, it'll just pull up like 100 listings, several hundred sometimes. And usually I scroll down and pick a variety of interesting, contrasting people. And that generally gets a pretty diverse range of people in the mix. But last time it was sort of a sausage fest. So, so sorry, everyone. But now this month, hopefully that's balanced out a little bit more. And always appreciate any additions that you all have to make to this to these videos. So please add in any Mercury and Virgos that you know of with good stories that seem to match. But watch how the contrast between light and dark, innocence and innocence lost, oftentimes with a specific quality of the child versus the adult, that those qualities come out with Virgo people, and often Mercury Virgo people who are very talented. Let me give you a few examples. So let's go to, let's start with Macaulay Culkin. That is a simple one. Here is the famous childhood actor, and there's a lot of I know there's like a lot of childhood actors, but Macaulay Culkin, in a weird sense, is like someone who, when you look at you just keep thinking Kevin from Home Alone. And there's a weird way in which, like, he even jokes on social media about, hey, look at I'm not a little kid anymore. I'm 40, or whatever the case might be. He, of course, had this incredible youthful, boyish charm that captivated audiences and made a cult classic movie. But he also, there was a movie that he did, and I don't know if you guys remember this, but it was called The Good Son. And it was this contrasting view of him as a really jealous little boy who was like actually a murderer. And he was like slowly trying to kill his family members or something like that. It was really creepy. And then of course later in life he dealt with a lot of addiction as well, and he's talked very openly about the fact that being this childhood lovable, innocent, bright light really sort of messed him up. And you will find that story repeated again and again, not only with Virgo in general, but with Mercury and Virgo people who have these really these gifted mercurial skills or traits. So there are others. One that I found really interesting is another one that fits a similar bill as Mark Hamill, who played Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. So he has this kind of childhood, youthful run of success, and he's of course he's a skilled voice actor later in his career, and he does a lot of other work. But there is a way in which you can never really recapture being the innocent young Luke Skywalker. And again, I'm picking on some basic themes to start with that you'll often see repeated, where there's this feeling of eternal youth that either you can't get back to, or that somehow is stained or tarnished. I mean, is it really? That's part of the journey of Virgo, right? Can it really be tarnished? But it may seem like it is, or feel like it is, and there's something lost that you can't regain. River Phoenix is another really great example of someone who has this. He has a really eclectic background. His family was in a cult when he was a child, and he at one point was like panhandling, I believe, or playing music for money or something like that out in the streets with his sister. So he has this really sort of. He described it, I think, as a desperate situation when he was younger, and really had no education, and so on and so forth. And then later in life, he goes on to become this really amazingly talented actor. But how is he known? He's known as one of the kind of tragedies of Hollywood, this promising young person who, in some ways, he dies too young and can't fulfill the promise, and drugs are part of that again. So similar, Amy Winehouse. Amy Winehouse is a great example of another person who, she's kind of brought up with an interest in music, and she's this young, talented. If you ever see the movie Amy, it was a really good movie. I went to the theater with my wife and saw it back in the day. It was about almost 10 years ago, I think it came out. I don't remember. I think she might have passed in like 2010 or 11, and maybe it came out in like a few years later, so maybe it wasn't that long ago. But anyway, there's another tragic story of this young, talented girl who, that's a whole mess of a story. I'm not like so well read on Amy Winehouse, but what do people say about Amy Winehouse? She was too young. She had this talented, and she was a total craftsman. She had this amazing craftsmanship and skill, and people will say, that she was technically very, very good as a musician. But then it's lost. There's like this contrasting loss of innocence that she has through addiction and codependency in relationships, and she had problems with her parents, and it's like she's suspended animation in this childhood promise. So Whitney Houston is another very similar one, where Whitney Houston is brought up basically in a family of very talented people, gospel singers. I think she was cousins or second cousins or first cousins or something with like Dionne Warwick. Am I getting that right? Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But a really talented family, a lot of pressure as a young girl to become a pop star, which she did. But then it's like there's this delayed thing. And I know that this story is not unique to Virgos. It happens to a lot of people in Hollywood in general, but you will be shocked to find out how many Mercury and Virgo people have these highly again, like especially if there's a couple of other placements in Virgo, these really amazing talents and abilities that are mercurial in nature, but that they come from some really intense contrast between light and darkness, childhood and loss of innocence, and themes like that. So Whitney Houston, another one who ends up having a lot of health problems. Of course, she has problems with her husband at one point. Not just one point, but for a while. And then there's interesting contrasts between light and dark that come in other forms, right? Like one that I find really interesting is Madonna. Madonna has Mercury in Virgo, and she's basically someone who plays on the entire theme of purity versus corruption, chastity and virginity versus, sexual empowerment, and what is the real power of the feminine. And of course, she's an amazingly gifted musician, singer-songwriter, etc. So Madonna, and her childhood background is really interesting too, not that I can't go into it right now, but Freddie Mercury, literally part of the Queen emblem and the way that it was made was with the fact that he has so much Virgo energy, and he had that literally in mind, along with the zodiacal symbolism of the other band members, by the way. That's all part of the Queen emblem. But Freddie Mercury, literally, that's not his real name, but he takes up the name Freddie Mercury as a way of also honoring the strong mercurial symbolism in his chart. And if you want to talk about, another young, talented person, and well, of course, he becomes emblematic of a lot of the AIDS epidemic and growing awareness about the epidemic, and so forth. And so, and also as one of the first like truly great, mega successful gay rock stars, and not the first, but one of the first who really, and of course Queen, there's pride in being gay and being who I am. That's the Freddie, and Freddie Mercury has this way also of trying to hold, there's a youthfulness that he holds on to all the way through. And also if you saw them, I don't know if any of you saw the movie Bohemian Rhapsody, but that was a really interesting look at his childhood and his family background as well. So Freddie Mercury is another great example. Another example of, oftentimes you'll find that people who write about or talk about or have some really deep focus on children and the transition between childhood and adulthood, like that initiation, will embody this too. For example, River Phoenix, one of his most famous films that he starred in was Stand By Me, which was one of my favorite movies of all time, by the way. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. It's a really good one. In that movie, he plays a young boy who is a part of a group of young boys who go looking for the dead body of a classmate of theirs who was apparently hit by a train, they think. And so they go to find that body, and it's a story about the loss of innocence and the loss of childhood and moving into young adulthood. And it is just perfectly Virgoan in that sense. Now, J.K. Rowling is another example of someone in terms of the subject matter of her magnum opus, Harry Potter, which is all about young children who are being initiated into the mysteries of light and dark, innocence and Innocence Lost. Those stories are you could say that they initiated a whole generation of readers, you could say, of very young readers, in the same way that previous books like The Lord of the Rings or the Narnia Chronicles may have done so for others. That's really interesting. Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel is an interesting one because she basically, in the kind of cross-dressing Mercury way, where Mercury can go feminine or masculine, Coco Chanel allowed women to have a more chic, sporty, casual, and some would say slightly more masculine look, and make that make that something that is available to women as well, so they could get out of tight, restrictive, overly feminized and trapping apparel and fashion. And she's famous for that. And her childhood story is interesting as well. I won't go into it, but just notice the way that there can also be contrasts between the masculine and the feminine that are there. There's that double-bodied nature of Mercury. Sting is another good example of someone where there's a real kind of fluidity. There's like a real sexual fluidity that most people know that he's sort of famous for, in terms of his, yeah, he's kind of a tantric guy, and also super craftsman. And okay, so I've got more to run through. Sting I think is a pretty good example when it comes to talking about the sort of sexual fluidity. There are others like that too. Tori Amos comes to mind. Tori Amos was brought up, Methodist preacher's kid. That's me too. So we're bound to get in trouble if you're a PK. But yeah, so she was like, she was a preacher's kid who grew up a virtuoso from a very young age, like 3 years old, with the piano, and eventually was let go of the scholarship that she had when she was a little bit older, like 10 or 11 or something like that, I read, because she had an interest in rock music. And then, interestingly enough, her father took a position in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is where our yoga studio was. And she ended up playing like open mics and things like that at gay bars and at other places that her father would sort of chaperone. And I think it's just really interesting, though, that she had this aversion to elements of the religion that she was raised with. She had a rebelliousness and a desire to explore themes of darkness, and was also a childhood wonder, right? And then she became this voice of I want to say like avant-garde and resistance. I mean, part of that, like that 90s scene that was so alternative. And of course, a strong voice for feminine and what I would call the goddess in music. So Ray Charles is similar in the sense of being a child wizard. Like he had like all of these really incredible technical abilities. He was interested in taking things apart and back together, like apparently when he was really young. Of course, he has glaucoma. I think it's glaucoma. He loses his eyesight, and then, but he ends up becoming this, again, virtuoso on the piano. So the main theme that I want to communicate with Virgo is Mercury in Virgo is not just super talented Mercury stuff because it's such a strong Mercury. It's also that contrast between light and dark, childhood and innocence lost. H.P. Lovecraft is another really good example. H.P. Lovecraft, when he was young, was in a well-to-do family. If you know, he's a very strange and interesting author. If you guys know his work, which is sort of sci-fi, horror, suspense, thriller, all like macabre. It's super macabre. Anyway. So Lovecraft was born into a family that was very wealthy, but people started dying and the wealth started being lost. And not surprisingly, he became this really talented writer, but also informed by the idea that we live in a rather meaningless universe that doesn't really care so much about human beings. So there's this really strong theme of innocence lost, and naivete, and even like anthropocentrism, and then he's sort of trying to swipe people off that anthropocentric platform in his writing. And I had to read him in grad school. I thought he was interesting. Not my taste so much, but that background of his childhood is super, super important. Lance Armstrong, childhood phenom in terms of his athletic ability. He's a very gifted athlete from an early age, but then, of course, the innocence is lost. He takes steroids. He starts cheating. And one of the things he said in a documentary, or an interview that I was watching with him not long ago, because I do a whole spiel on him in my year 2 class. We break his chart down. One of the things that I heard him say was that he said, if I could just go back to when I was a teenager and, kind of tell myself that there's not as much at stake. But then another thing that he does, so in other words, you don't need to cheat. But another thing that he said, which is really interesting, is he said, back then in the 90s, the culture was just like everyone was doing this and it wasn't such a big deal. And he has this way of almost like reminiscing or wanting to go back to a different time, a time when he was pure, and a time when before the innocence was lost, or almost like he feels that something culturally changed that was unfair to him. And the fact that he hammers on that so much, as well as saying, yeah, and I wish I wouldn't have thought I lost my innocence somehow. That's a really important. Of course, he's a very talented athlete, and don't sleep on how important Mercury, exalted Mercury, can be in an athlete's chart. Tom Brady is another great example, who was, one of the, probably the GOAT in terms of football, quarterbacks in football. Howard Hughes, you can also see this tilt into darkness. Howard Hughes is a good example, someone who kind of loses his mind. He's a great engineer and kind of an inventor, and aviator and things like that, but he also sort of loses it. So that the tilt into madness or losing your mind or something like that can be a part of it as well. It can be, sometimes it's physical illness or sickness or what have you. Liz Green, the astrologer, she's a really great example of someone who was known in the astrological world for really being able to investigate the depth and the darkness of the archetypes in astrology and the unconscious dimensions of the psyche. And she is someone who will help get you out of the glitzy, glittery pop astrology very quickly, because she is very willing to strip away the naivety and just be like, no, we need to go into the underworld. Check out her book, The Astrology of Fate. Anything you read by her, though, is she's very willing to kind of go carefully, methodically. She's a total master craftsman, and she goes right into, the belly of the beast. She goes right into the unconscious and gives you a sense of what's really there behind the signs, the planets, aspects, and so forth. It's one of the reasons why I love her so much, is because when you first start learning astrology, you're like, yeah, this is nice, but I get the feeling that this is thousands of years old and that there's a lot more than meets the eye here, that there's a lot more underneath the surface. What is it? Well, sometimes you think about Virgo as very wholesome and meticulous and organized and pure and all of that, but don't forget this tilt into darkness that is such an important part of the trajectory of Virgo. Mother Teresa is my last example. Here is someone who, as a very young girl, felt the call to monastic life. There's that issue of purity. However, the call within the call, as she put it, was to serve and live among the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, which she did. I know that there are criticisms that people make of her and the way that some of the things were done, and fair enough. But I, as someone who grew up with a mother who deeply admired and respected her, because my mom went to Catholic school too, but I went and saw her convent. Is that what it's called? Yeah. I went and saw her ministry in Calcutta and read some of her journal and diary entries that are kept there. And I was blown away by how much her heart was really in the desire to be with and serve among the poorest of the poor, and how she went from this young girl with a very wholesome kind of pure desire to love and serve God and in cloistered life, totally giving herself to God, to this need to go out and see and be in and touch the darkness and frailty of human suffering. And I really appreciate that about her. And I appreciate that she also struggled with her own internal darkness and doubts, even when she was very old in her spiritual life. I think of that as very real, and something that contrasts the kind of pure Mother Teresa that everyone, and I'm always shocked when people, in the more, like, I know people in my own family, extended family and stuff like that, who are Catholics, who are like, well, she had her doubts at the end. It's like, well, I hope so. You know what I mean? Like, our faith life, doubt is part of the texture of what makes our faith really rich and deep. And in the Bhakti tradition anyway, doubt shows an emotional engagement and investment with divinity, not some absence of it. Doubt shows a wrestling with divinity that is said to be a particular mood of devotional life that comes and goes, just like different seasons and weather patterns come and go. It's to be embraced. And what I love about Virgo is that Virgo is not just about nice, organized, helpful people. It's also about the need for the pure, innocent, naive image to wrestle with and invite in darkness, doubt, worry, anxiety. And these things become sanctified and sacred if we let them. So I hope that you've enjoyed this little tour of Mercury and Virgo. Hopefully I won't be so behind as Mercury enters Libra. There's going to be some good things to talk about there. So stay tuned. And don't forget my new class is coming up. Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystics starts on November 14th, the year-long program in Hellenistic Astrology. 30 classes on the year. You can take it remotely or you can participate live via webinar. There's 12 guest lectures as well. We have a good portion of the course dedicated to theory and then a good portion dedicated to implementing theory with live clients. So it's a great hands-on experience. There's need-based tuition if you need it. If you're struggling because of COVID-19 or you're out of work and or only working part-time or something like that, you're free to apply for the need-based tuition. Early bird discount is in effect right now as well. So I hope to see some of you there soon. Any questions, feel free to email me info@nightlightastrology.com. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.